Welcome to Getting Common with Professor Carliss Chatman. Getting Common covers a variety of topics and features guests from business, law, politics, government, education, and some of the most insightful entrepreneurs. It's a refreshing, common sense approach to some of the most important discussion points today. Now, here is your host, Carliss Chatman.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Getting Common. I am your host, Carliss Chatman. In my day job, I'm an associate professor at Washington and Lee's Law School. The topic of today's episode is, should the law subsidize driving? And my guests, Greg Shill and Sara Bronin, have written extensively on our nation's obsession with driving and our driving culture and the structures and laws that fuel our reliance on cars. Sara had to step away for a minute, so what I'm going to do is have Greg introduce himself and start. And then when we talk to Sara about the first question, she'll just introduce herself. So Greg, go ahead and introduce yourself for our guests.
Thanks, Carliss, and thanks for having me. I'm a law professor at the University of Iowa, and I write about transportation and law, and I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. So to kick us off, when I first started reading Greg's work, and before I ever read Greg's work, in my opinion, I was like, I just happen to like driving. I didn't really think about the structures and the laws in place that made me need to love driving and need to like driving. So Greg, I'd love for you to just start out and tell us, what role has the law played in us developing this culture of being reliant on cars?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to frame it, Carliss. Let me just preface this by saying I grew up in about an hour outside of Detroit. I was going to the Detroit Auto Show in diapers. I personally like cars. Not everybody who shares the opinions that I'm going to voice today has that perspective. But I don't think that really matters very much. And let me just say why. I think there's cars as, a tool, cars as a passion or a hobby. And then there's cars as something that we're dependent on. And nobody wants to be dependent on a technology. Certainly not. They want to be able to have some choice. And they also want to, I think, minimize the costs of that technology, whether it's for themselves or the social costs. So I like cars. I enjoy going to a target shooting range or shooting skeet, but I think we ought to have rules that make, gun ownership and gun use safe as well. So that's kind of how I would analogize it. On the law point, there are a lot of legal structures that make driving de facto necessary. And anybody who's not tuning in from a big city on the East Coast or maybe San Francisco probably lives this reality every day, where if you want a jug of milk or take your kids to school, really the only option is a car. And that's absolutely partly a choice, partly a question of consumer preference and American culture. But it is also partly a question of law, which we'll be getting into.
All right. And now Sara is with us. So Sara, what we'll have you do is introduce yourself, and then I will kick the first question off to you.
Sure. I'm Sara Bronin. I'm a professor at Cornell University in the Department of Planning and also affiliated with the law school. And I have a past history as a city planning commission chair.
So one reason I invited Sara on the show is because she's both an architect and a lawyer. And Greg kind of kicked us off with explaining how, while we have a passion for cars and we can like cars, there are certain aspects of the law that make it a necessity. I think it would be great if you could explain to us how policies have combined with structural design to make us dependent on cars. And specifically, the idea that we all are in single family, single passenger cars.
Yeah, so I think a lot of how we get from one place to another has to do with how we design our cities and how we design our roads. So zoning policies that separate land uses from each other, that separate residential uses from commercial uses, from shops, from services, from offices. That kind of zoning has led to more driving. So you would call that the rules of how we create our community. In addition, we have rules that dictate how our roads must be designed, how wide they have to be, how wide the lanes have to be, whether there can be crosswalks or not. and what they have to look like. So these rules, unfortunately, tend to be written in ways that favor drivers over other kinds of users. So in terms of the design of our cities and the design of our roads, we've written laws in a way that has ended up reinforcing a car culture, even when many people, as we know, may not want even to use cars.
Just the zoning thing always makes me think. I'm from Houston, Texas, which has no zoning, right? It's notorious for having no zoning. And when I think about the neighborhood that I grew up in, the nearest bus stop was half a mile away. And that, like, you kind of needed to walk further than half a mile to get to the bus stop, because I was in a subdivision and, you had to like walk out to the main street. But even when you walked out to the main street, and this gets to Sarah's point about the design, like the sidewalk would end. So if I wanted to walk to the grocery store, I would be walking like in a field next to like fast moving cars, right? So even in a place like Houston that has no zoning, we have roads designed in a way without the emphasis of zoning that clearly favor cars over people. And I just wonder, in both of your scholarship, have you explored like how that happens? Even in places where we don't have zoning in place, we still are prepping cars when we design roads.
Well, I'm going to hop in because I have a Houston story of my own. I clerked in Houston, so I lived there for a year, and I lived about a mile from the courthouse. And I did own a car, but it's only a mile, and it was a pleasant enough walk, with one exception, which is I had to play Frogger to get across a freeway off ramp. I think it was 45 South. Mm-hmm. And the alternative, I could have gone around. It would have virtually doubled my journey. So that I didn't do that, and it felt safe enough at the time. I was a young, healthy person, fully able-bodied and everything, but not everybody has those privileges. And of course, even then I was taking some risks. And then, there were lots of stories along the way. People would pull over and ask if I needed a ride, if anything was okay. Meanwhile, I'm walking downtown in the fourth biggest city in America, which should be a normal activity. We design our roads in a way quite independent of zoning to foster fast driving at the expense of other forms of transportation, even at the expense of slower, safer driving, and also beyond transportation at the expense of other uses, right? So if your kid's elementary school is on a road and the playground maybe abuts that road, you might have one opinion about how fast cars should be driving on that road, versus if your only goal is to get from point A to point B, and that school with that road is between point A and B, then you probably want to, more highly value speed over not just safety, but like community health, community development. Unfortunately, we've created a system where the people who travel the longest distances and want to go the fastest have the most power. And so there are, of course, racial and economic equity, dimensions to that. But that's a part of the problem.
All right, Sara, do you have anything to add to that? Like, how do we end up even in places without zoning with these design flaws? Oh, Sarah's frozen. All right, well, I'll ask my next follow-up question, which is this. It sometimes feels like a chicken egg problem to me. Is it just that we want to travel alone in cars, so we demand these policies that support the habit? Or is it that it's become impossible to travel efficiently in other ways? Do you have a thought, Greg, on like which comes first?
Yeah, I would probably suggest looking at it a slightly different way, only because I don't think there's a great way to disentangle that, right? And you end up getting into historical questions, and then it's like, how much do we care what decisions were made in 1950 and that sort of thing? So what I would ask is, should we create a system so that everybody can get to their core destinations that are necessities without a car, at least in cities of a certain size, right? You're not going to have a system where there's robust public transit in a tiny rural area. The density won't support that without enormous public expenditure, which we can talk about, but that's probably not where to start, right? But in a place like Houston, fourth biggest city in the country, it's really the poorest people who don't have cars, and they have a much lower quality of life as a result. And so, when you think about how to provide not just transportation, but ideally reduce the need for transportation by legalizing construction of grocery stores and other necessities that are close enough that people don't need to drive in the first place. And we also need public transit. But then the second point is that the we here is probably heterogeneous, like more heterogeneous than might be evident from, say, a radio show that does like a traffic report, where really their intended audience is drivers stuck in traffic. I've never listened for or looked out for a traffic report when I'm walking to work, or even if I'm taking public transportation. And so you have a situation where people who actually have, when they do have more efficient mechanisms to get to work, are actually less engaged and less politicized. And so there are many dimensions to this, but I would say, I would focus on creating that universal ability to access destinations regardless of car ownership. And then there's no country in the world, including countries where people get around by transit or by bicycle, for example, much more than the US. In places like Denmark, where that's true, or the Netherlands, most people own cars, right? And people can drive very freely. In fact, they have much better maintained roads. Anybody who's driven over there will tell you that it's a pleasure to drive, whereas driving in Houston or in Chicago or in New York City is anything but a pleasure.
Absolutely. I live in Charlottesville and work in Lexington. And when I tell people, when they're like, how do you live an hour away from work? And I'm like, well, when I was in Houston, I lived 9 miles from work, and that was an hour, except it was not a drive through the mountains that was pleasant. It was sitting on the off ramp that Greg had to cross when he walked and waiting like 30 minutes, just, at a complete stop. Now, Sara, now that you're back, Greg and I were kind of talking about, how is it even in places without zoning like Houston that we end up with these structures?
Yes, I was trying to say before I got cut off by my lovely internet that I'm from Houston as well. So I grew up in Gulfton, which is in, I guess, the Sharpstown greater orbit. And obviously the hodgepodge of land uses contributes to some negative consequences in the city. And the amount of driving that people have to do in Houston is not really, because there's no zoning, it's not reinforced. It's reinforced. It's the driving is created because assumptions by city leaders are that everybody will continue to want to drive. And so why not keep expanding Westheimer? Why not keep expanding the highways? But the reality is that many people in Houston don't have cars. The meager bike lanes that have been put up downtown and other places do get used. People have started to use the light rail medical center to downtown. That's been there for several years, and I know it's been expanded. It's not huge ridership because it doesn't go far enough, but the fact that we redesigned Main Street in Houston to accommodate for that new type of transportation suggests maybe there's hope. But people need to show city leaders that they want that kind of transportation by actually using it. So I would encourage my fellow native Houstonians to show their support of transit options, so that city leaders don't keep assuming that that's how they want to live.
Yeah, and I think the biggest problem with the public transportation in Houston is being stranded, right? Whenever I think about when I'm home and I'm like, I could walk to the light rail station, it's like, but wait, what time does it run? How far does it go? Greg and I are talking about, I call it like a chicken egg problem. Like, do I really want to drive my car all the time? Or like, are the structures not in place so that like, it feels like this vicious cycle. But I just know of how many times, my dad likes to take the rail, for example. And essentially he's taking the light rail because he knows that one of us can come pick him up if he's stranded, right? Like, because it happens in Houston, right? Like the rail stops running at weird times of day.
I think that underscores the difficulty of being an individual in a system, right? Swimming upstream is only going to get you so far. In the case of the light rail, I was excited to take it and did take it sometimes when I lived there, but they made a decision at some point to not give it dedicated right of way. And the trade-offs in transportation are not always zero sum, but when you're talking about the right of way, meaning the space between the buildings, where you have the street and then sidewalk, if there's a sidewalk, you are making allocation decisions there where to the extent that there's a lot of demand for that space, it will fill up. And so you have to make choices affirmatively about what you want to fill that space. And so if you allow the train to be bogged down in car traffic, it's going to be slow, probably slower than the cars, actually, even though it's in the same traffic, because it has to stop at the stations in addition to the stoplights, and it's very big and lumbering. So that was a choice that they made. Other cities have made different choices that separate the grade or give it its own dedicated right of way, and then it's faster. So let's take the L in Chicago, for example. In most places, it doesn't have to interact with cars, so it can move more quickly.
I don't know why we didn't elevate it. And you two can tell me why. I mean, I know it's the cost. I understand it's totally the cost.
Partly the cost. What do you think the property owners who are next door would say? They would say people are going to hang out underneath, and it's going to become this like gross, like having a highway overpass, but all the way. Of course, Houston has millions of those, but generally, I don't know the story specifically, but in most cases, it's absolutely a mix of cost and politics. And even getting the light rail done as it was a big political lift. And often you get these compromises that they seem like they're 50-50. It's like, you didn't want light rail and you did want light rail. So now we have it, but it's shares with the cars. That seems like a compromise. But at some point, it's kind of like splitting the baby, where you actually don't get even half of the results. Because it's so bogged down in traffic that ridership remains low.
Yeah, I would say it's mostly only useful for, med center employees who park and ride, from downtown. Rodeo, it's great, right? During the rodeo, everyone takes the light rail. But
I took it for rodeo.
Yeah, right. But the rest of the year, it feels inconvenient. I would take it for doctor's appointments when I worked downtown because it made sense. But otherwise, I wasn't really taking it. Now for the next segment, I'd love to talk about what many people think which is what's the big deal here. And I think everyone thinks it's a big deal right now because gas is really expensive and they are looking for alternatives. But, when gas prices recover and we all kind of get more complacent, folks seem to think, why is this a big deal? It's okay. I live out of my car, and I still do because I'm a native Houstonian and it's a bad habit. And I like being able to haul my entire life with me. But then people also have the other perspective of, well, can we even do anything about it? Are we too far gone? So I'll kind of start with you on this one, Greg. Is this really an issue we should care about? Should we really be trying to think about alternatives?
Yeah, absolutely. The problems associated with fossil fuels are so vast that we could spend the rest of the hour talking about it, right? So you have costs to households, you have greenhouse gas emissions, then you have the fact that it props up dictators in countries where they're able to oppress their populations and make war and so on, and then U.S. foreign policy gets embroiled in that. And I'm not even just talking about what's going on right now, but think back to prior generations and oil shocks and so on. So I think if we could be less, dependent on oil, we'd be better off as a society in basically every single category. But that being said, in the moment, absolutely, it's hitting the pocketbooks of regular people. The other things, there are a lot of other things that are hitting regular people's pocketbooks right now. So, like rent increases and other price increases. And then we have people who aren't driving, right? Because they can't afford a car, or maybe they have one car in their household, but they primarily get around by bus. And it's not likely that they're being directly impacted if they aren't driving by rising gas prices. But they are impacted by service cuts. And there have been so many service cuts to public transit as a wave of cuts post 2008. And then there were COVID cuts. And I don't think there's, I mean, it might be one or two, but I don't think there are really many agencies that have come back from their COVID cuts completely. And so these are, people who are struggling too, but they really are not. Their struggles are not the focus of policy conversations right now.
Now, Sara, do you have ideas for, well, first I'd love if you could shed light on some of the other policies that are out there that facilitate our car culture. And then think about, are there other things or other reasons why we should care about this?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons is that American roads have become increasingly dangerous. If you look even during the pandemic, when we were supposedly doing less driving, people were driving faster, and there were more road deaths and injuries, higher year-over-year increase than something like 96 years in 2020 when it came to road deaths. And that, I believe, continued last year when we just got the statistics, I think a couple of weeks ago. So it's not just these broader societal and economic implications of using cars that should lead us to care, but it's that all of us who use roads, which are most of us every day, are vulnerable because of the danger of our roads. So in terms of policies, I mean, to your question, should we do anything? Should we just give up? No, of course we should. We should never give up. I mean, that's the whole. I guess the whole impetus for being a law professor and trying to influence some of these policies at the local level, in my view anyway, is because the law can improve, because we can make it better, because we have to make it better. So I guess I'm an optimist in that regard. So no, never give up. Fight for every intersection out there if you're listening. And some of the things you can do in terms of policies to make that happen are to look at the way that your local government, look at the design manual, if you can find it, of your local government, try to figure out how city engineers are making decisions, try to go to planning and zoning commission meetings, see what they say when they're approving large projects, including subdivision projects that lay out roads, speak at public meetings, try to explain to policymakers that there are lots of different ways that people want to get around our cities, and fight for those ways to be included in zoning codes. I was just looking, I'm writing a book on zoning, and I was just looking at the zoning code of San Diego, which rezoned a couple of its major shopping centers, Fashion Valley and Mission Valley, to allow for densification, because these were pretty old-fashioned malls type developments. And one of the things they did in their zoning code was they said that for any lot over 5 acres, the property owner would have to put in bicycle paths through the lot and paseos, which are pedestrian walkways through the lot. So those are the kinds of things that cities are doing that are creative, that help to create the infrastructure for the actual movement. At the same time, we should look at policies that are creating infrastructure that supports the things that we could use to get around in more efficient ways. So one of those things is bike parking. Lots of cities are starting to consider this. Some have adopted it. Hartford, where I was chair of the commission, did adopt bike parking requirements. City of Cambridge has them, other cities around the country. And what those are anytime something new gets built, you have to put a certain number of bike parking spaces. Now, this may seem pretty dumb or straight or obvious, but the reality is we don't have places where people can actually park their bikes, even if they decide to use them. So indoor facilities for office workers and college students, outdoor facilities for short-term bikers who want to just pop in and out of a retail shop. All of that kind of infrastructure is something that needs to be created. If it's not created by the public, it can be created through private developers, private property owners who are improving their properties over time. And that's something else that can be instituted through zoning or city ordinance. So those are just a few ideas of how we might start, how much you might start the process as listeners to try to break that dependency in your own communities.
Now, Greg, earlier you mentioned some of the racial implications of our policies and our structures. Could you just explain to the audience, how the ways that our roads are designed and the way the law around driving has had racial implications?
So like a lot of things in our society, ostensibly neutral sources of regulation have disparate impacts, right? So because they interact with other structures in our society to produce those consequences. So Black pedestrians, for example, are at a much higher risk of being struck and killed by drivers. Now, there are some confounding variables there because you have to consider the fact that people of different races don't live in exactly the same places. So there are lots and lots of different things that could influence that type of outcome. The authors of the study that I'm referring to here, which is done by Smart Growth America, controlled for that, or at least controlled for probably the most important one, which is walking rates at the census tract level. So that you would expect, for example, that people who are pedestrians more often might be at higher risk of being struck as a pedestrian. They controlled for that. And they still found that Black people were at a risk of, it's about 2/3, if I recall,
Wow.
higher chance than white people of being killed by a driver. There are also studies that show that drivers don't yield to Black pedestrians as frequently as they do to non-Black pedestrians by a significant margin. And for many of us, that doesn't sound surprising given other things that we know about our society. Native Americans face an even higher risk. It's about twice the population as a whole, and a little bit more than twice white people. And that's partly due to reservations, Native American reservations having just terrible infrastructure, both for driving and especially for walking. And so about 3/4 of pedestrian deaths overall happen at night. And so you have to think about the interaction of these factors. You have no sidewalk and you're walking on the side of the road in maybe a reservation, not a particularly built up area, and there's no lighting, right? I mean, that's not an ingredient for safety. So that's one glimpse of them. The more layers of the onion you peel back, honestly, the worse it gets. Your ability to survive a car crash depends on a lot of things. One of them is the quality of medical care that you can expect. And so I personally think it's appropriate for planners and transportation engineers to take that into account when they are building systems to optimize for safety. So if you know that a lot of people served by your transportation system are going to have difficulty getting excellent medical care, then that should probably influence how you rank safety among your priorities. And they'll all tell you safety is job one, and then they'll give you 50 reasons why it can't be for this project where you're proposing a safety enhancement. So even within the US, there are states that are about 4 times, the safest states in terms of road mortality risk are about 4 times safer than the most dangerous states. That's a tremendous amount of variation. And a lot of it has to do with road design. Other things are more indirect, like the quality of hospitals and the prevalence of medical insurance. And those latter 2 things are really beyond the influence of a city planner or a transportation official or engineer. But they do have control over how safe their systems are. And so that's a reason to optimize there. And because of broader socioeconomic inequalities, Black Americans have worse access to medical care, right? Because partly as a function of income and partly as a function of racism. And so that's one reason why it's more dangerous to be a Black pedestrian and to be a Black driver than to be a white one.
Sarah, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just add that similar statistics are true for the Latino community as well as older people who tend to be vulnerable, pedestrians and bikers. I will add to the factors too, in terms of the injury, the design of the vehicle that hits you. So the fact that we have different vehicle standards in the United States than they do in Europe seems to be leading to a much higher rate of fatalities and injuries among people in smaller cars and pedestrians and bikers who are hit by some of the very large cars that we allow from through our vehicle design standards. So we might say that the way that the federal government regulates vehicles also plays a role. So if you're hit by a very large pumped up truck, you have a very different likelihood of survival than you are if you're hit by a low, let's maybe say Toyota Prius or something, which hits you in the legs as opposed to in the chest. So tall dashboards, the fact that we can have these really huge tires that make cars taller even when they're not designed with tall dashboards in mind. The fact that the fronts of cars in the United States can be fortified to a much stronger degree than in Europe, that we can put bull bars on the front of our cars, which harden the car and protect the passengers of the car, but actually make it much more dangerous and deadly for people who are hit by that car, whether they're in smaller cars or pedestrians or bikers. So when a car is so strong that it doesn't crumble, that means that the impact on the third party is much more dangerous. So I'll just throw vehicle design in there as something that I would encourage us to look at, although many of us who work in local communities and in planning fields don't have the expertise to influence that kind of design. And in fact, the system is set up such that only really car makers can influence those kinds of standards at the federal level. Or car makers are people who are deeply, deeply enmeshed in car design as opposed to ordinary people. And that too is one of the problems with our system, is that advocates and ordinary people who have experienced the impacts of poor road design, poor vehicle design, poor city design, don't really have a forum where they can go and voice those concerns and make a real change in the law.
I don't know if y'all know the answer to this, but is the way that we super fortify our vehicles in the United States necessary? Is it resulting in fewer vehicle fatalities than in Europe, where the cars don't have all these bars on them and super big tires?
It's resulting in more protection for the passengers of those cars and much less protection for anybody that's hit by those cars. I think that's how I would summarize the statistics. And Greg, feel free to chime in there. But
I think that's a reasonable inference. I have the same concerns as Sara. I've been looking for, I think it's just too new of a trend to have hard data on the impact. So we know that when people are hit by large, heavy vehicles, they have a lower chance of survival. What we don't know is how the visibility trade-offs interact with that. And these large vehicles have a real blind spot right in front, but they also have visibility advantages on other dimensions. And the very big trucks tend to be less common in the most pedestrian heavy areas compared to other areas. So I absolutely agree it's cause for concern. I think regulators ought to look at it. My understanding is that they are in the current administration. I don't know exactly where they are at that. I think car makers have a reduced responsibility to the public and to their own shareholders to look at this because of the possibility of litigation, both mass tort and shareholder litigation. And I would hope that car companies would step up and study this. The U.S. has far worse safety outcomes. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, just on that point, there are a couple of studies, though, and I cited a couple of them in an article that I just published called Rules of the Road. And there's one, I was trying to find it, but there's one from 2012 rather, called Bull Bars and Vulnerable Road Users, which actually summarizes some of those studies. So I think that there's a little bit out there before you move on to the next point, but not much, like you said.
Absolutely. So bull bars, there are studies on, they've been outlawed in a few countries, but not in the US. Oh, wow. These are, for any listeners who may not be familiar, these are if you look at your typical police car these days, it has these aggressive looking bars on the front. And then a lot of private citizens have also added them to the front of their vehicles. So they're outlawed in the UK and some other countries because of their negative impacts on people and cars that they hit. The other, the SUVs and the truck stuff, there's I have not found the evidence persuasive on that yet, but I think it's a reasonable inference that they are more dangerous. One reason to think that the problem, that's one component, but not the full story in our, radically disproportionate bad outcomes on road safety, is that in the US and Canada alike, SUVs and trucks have taken off in the 2010s and in the last few years. But Canada has their roads are twice as safe as ours. So they have half the road mortality risk as a percentage of the population. You have one half the risk in Canada of being killed by a car that you do in the US. And that's true, even though they've undergone a similar transformation in their fleet from cars to trucks in the last decade or so. So I think there are we should absolutely pull on this lever labeled vehicle design. But one thing that I try to get across in, talking about law and transportation is that there are, so many dimensions. And so it's important to pull on all of them. But there isn't one quick, there's no plastic straw that we can ban to get our way out of this.
Not that banning plastic straws does anything.
I am pro plastic straw.
I am very pro plastic straw as well. I don't, yeah. I just think, corporations are using billions of gallons of oil and you want me to drink out of a paper straw. I don't really understand what that does. Now one thing that I think about though, as y'all are talking, I think about myself personally, because as I said, I'm a native Houstonian, I live in my car. And I think about what made me stop driving sedans and what made me start driving SUVs. And some of that was the amount of other cars on the road, how big the other cars on the road are. I feel like I'm going to die in a little car. And so then I need to get a bigger car and I'm not very tall. So it's I need to get a bigger car because I don't feel safe. But then all the other people get bigger cars. And it feels like it just becomes this vicious cycle of, I can't live without my car. I need the biggest fortress of a car possible because there's so many other huge cars on the road. And then it's oh, wait, but that person has the bull bars on their car. Well, now I need an even bigger SUV. And then it does all the things to the environment. And then it does all the things with, the parking design, which I actually didn't get a chance to talk to Sara about. When I was reading through your papers, I had no idea that there are requirements of a minimum number of parking spaces when you build it. No clue. And so could you just inform people about that? Because I've always wondered, why does this shopping mall here with 100 parking spaces? Or why is there this mega ugly parking deck here? So just talk about what minimum parking requirements are and how that just fuels our need for cars even more.
Yeah, so minimum parking requirements usually established through zoning, but actually in Houston established through city ordinance, require a certain number of parking spaces for every kind of new development that happens in a city. So if you are building an apartment building, a zoning code might say you have to put 2 spaces for every unit of apartment. If you're building an office building, often the number is 1, 2, or 3 parking spaces for every 1,000 square feet of usable floor area. If you're building a restaurant, if you're putting it, even a restaurant owner has to have a minimum number of parking spaces. Oftentimes, these parking requirements are as much or more than the actual square footage that it's tied to. So some restaurants might have a requirement that it's 3 parking spaces for every 1,000 square feet. Well, when you put 3 cars together and you use the parking aisle, that's over 1,000 square feet. So you're sometimes required to build more parking than you are the thing itself. So this is problematic for a number of reasons. First, kind of going back to that bike parking requirement that I talked about, if you build the infrastructure for certain types of transportation, people will tend to use that type of transportation. We've built all this infrastructure through these incremental piecemeal zoning requirements for cars. We've built parking lots for cars. So the easiest way to get to that restaurant is usually going to be to drive, because if you have a vast sea of parking, if you're going to a shopping mall with a vast sea of parking, you could maybe maybe there's a bus line, maybe you could get there, but walking through that parking lot is so terribly unpleasant that you just say, okay, if I have a car, I'm going to drive. So it encourages driving, and studies have shown that that's the case. The more parking that's provided, the more likely it is people drive. There is a link. The other thing that parking requirements do is they drive up prices of development. So what they do, particularly for housing, is they make housing more expensive, because if you have a given lot, let's say it's an acre, and you're trying to build 10 units of housing, a 10-unit apartment building, you have to sometimes build, let's say 20, maybe sometimes 30 parking spaces for those 10 units. And what that does is it increases the amount of land that you have to devote to parking, and it shrinks the amount of land on that lot that you can devote to housing. So it makes the house, sometimes it reduces the amount of housing that can be provided. One place where we know that that's certainly true is Connecticut, where I've looked at zoning codes covering every single inch of the state, and looking at 15 towns with high walk scores, so places where you should want to walk from place to place because they have that infrastructure. We found that there are hundreds of thousands of units of housing that are specifically prohibited from being built because of parking requirements, keeping every other zoning constraint equal, keeping minimum lot size, maximum lot coverage, height requirements, et cetera. So we modeled in every lot buildings that can be built, and showed, and hopefully we'll publish that research soon, but showed that parking requirements constrain housing in these 15 cities alone to the tune of hundreds of thousands of units. Hartford is the first city in the country that completely banned minimum parking requirements. When I was in the Planning and Zoning Commission, Bridgeport nearby completely banned minimum parking requirements too. But even in places where you think that they're turning the tide, they haven't quite done it fully yet. Buffalo was the first to do it on for uses under 5,000 square feet. So they were the first on that front, but in terms of citywide, I claim Hartford as being that pioneer. And I really hope other cities do that. I say every time I talk about zoning, that minimum parking requirements are the number one thing that every zoning administrator should get rid of immediately with no regrets. Because if people want to build the parking and they need to build the parking, they will build it. Instead, cities should impose maximums on parking, and some have. So in San Diego, by the way, in that zone that I was just talking about with the infill development, trying to create new development in these shopping centers, they've imposed a maximum of 5.5 parking spaces per unit or something crazy. So it, like, even when you impose a maximum, you got to impose it low enough so that people won't build the kind of parking that we see already. But anyway, it's a start.
I just think about the pain of walking across a hot parking lot of asphalt on a summer day.
Yeah,
and
the
how
heat
that
island effects, stormwater runoff, the pollution that driving causes. It's an environmental disaster. In Connecticut, we actually just passed statewide reform that caps minimum parking requirements for all towns for housing. Towns can opt out, but again, at least it's a start.
I think these things need to be, they're critical, but a lot of people think I can never find parking when I want it. And so why are you going to go take my parking from me? Houston has about 30 spaces per person. There are about 30 parking spaces in Houston per person. And that's not because the free market decided that their demand for parking was so high that they had to build that many. It's because it's legally required.
Wow.
And that is an extreme case, but versions of that are true everywhere. So Des Moines has something like 10 spaces per person. That means if you're sitting on your couch, watching Netflix, there are 30 parking spaces just out there waiting for you to go to simultaneously a restaurant, a cafe, the movie theater. The fact that you can't build a bar without building oceans of parking is absurd. I mean, that should really give us pause if we care about the things that we purport to care about. For anybody who's skeptical, what I would urge you to do is go to Google Maps, turn on satellite view wherever you are, and zoom out. And just mentally circle all of the areas that are parking lots or parking structures, remembering that a parking structure is the equivalent of many, many times of its size in area. And I think you'll find for everywhere in America, except for Manhattan, that the off-street parking is just absolutely enormous. In Detroit, I think it's at 40% of the land area, for example.
Wow.
Then consider all the on-street parking. And in most places, you can park on the street at a low subsidized cost or for free most hours of the day. So factor that, circle those areas, and then think about people's garages and driveways and things of that nature. And you begin to get a handle on how much parking we actually have. And if we're willing to walk, 2 blocks, then we really can reduce like a huge proportion of the parking that we have without really any reduction in quality of life, actually an improvement, because we'll be able to build more housing will be more affordable, we'll have more amenities and less just open space that bakes the planet and ends up creating these, places that are not fun to walk.
I just think about 30 parking spaces per person in Houston, and that feel like, given how many people are in Houston, and then combine that with how wide I-10 is these days. I like
26 lanes.
Yeah, it just feels insane. It feels totally insane. Now, I would like to have our last segment be a positive, because, we kind of get negative Nancy when we talk about the law. And so I would love for both of you, if you could wave a magic wand or be a genie and rub a lamp, in an ideal world, what would the policies look like? What would it look like to be less dependent on driving? Sara, you can go first.
Oh gosh, well, I already gave my big reveal on the zoning side that parking requirements should be eliminated. That's a talking point that has bipartisan appeal, I think. The thing I would do for street design is to have communities, even if they're rural communities, actually look at the NACTO Street Design Guide, which is the National Association of City Transportation Officials. Take a look at that and consider how some of the streets that are offered as ideal streets in that manual might actually help to improve quality of life, improve the beauty of your community, but also improve its functionality for people, no matter what kind of mode of transportation they use. I would also make sure, in general conversations about policies, that the needs of underrepresented groups, whether that be underrepresented racial and ethnic minorities, but also older people, and particularly one group we haven't talked about yet, which is the disabled, how their voices can be better centered in conversations, especially at those federal levels, whether drafting the manual on uniform traffic control devices. And Greg and I have a piece on this one that talks about how this representation works or doesn't work, or drafting vehicle design standards. So I would encourage us to think more about how those voices can be centered. And then finally, the vehicle design standards, I would say, although I'm being focused on the land use and the planning sides, the vehicle design standards are really important. And for those who have the technical expertise to do that, I think that there's a lot that can be learned from European design standards, and how we might make sure that the roads are safer for everybody by considering adopting some of those. So those are some of my quick ideas off the cuff, and I'll pitch it over to Greg because I know he has tons more.
Those are all great ideas. Generally, I would think about these things in terms of carrots and sticks. And so the stick idea would be something along the lines of a carbon tax, which, if current outrage about gas prices doesn't give people pause about the political viability of that type of thing, I would urge people to reflect on that a little bit. Economists have been pushing this for at least 15 years, and even states like Washington and others that are environmentally conscious have been opposing them in referenda and in legislation. So I think, and that was before prices went up. So, looking on the carrot side, I would take if I had a magic wand, I would take the zoning code and put it in the trash and just start anew and write something that's like 1 page long that says you can't put, a garbage dump next to a preschool, and, you can't put a 100, a Jeff Bezos, if he has some, egotistical dream, he wants to put a 1,000-story skyscraper, the tallest in the world, in a small town. He can't do that. Okay, so let's take the extremes off the table and let people build what they want, where they want, which used to be the case until about 100 years ago. And it's not an accident that now, we've had about 40 years of restrictive zoning and a little bit longer for some of the parking mandates. And that's created this sprawly, unaffordable landscape. And now we have a real housing crisis, more than even a gas crisis as a result. And there is a way to address both of those, which is just to build more units, but that's illegal right now. So we should change that.
And, but I mean, I think, how does that impact places like Houston with no zoning?
Yeah.
So Houston has,
yeah. Well, the alleged no zoning, I should say,
Well,
no zoning in air
That's
quotes.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say that many residential subdivisions that have been built in Houston are subject to restrictive covenants, which control what is built from a use perspective, but also from a design perspective. So those communities that may not have zoning, that have sprung up around the country because they're in out of the way unincorporated areas, they still have restrictive covenants, which often establish very similar guiding principles, as well as similar administrative procedures in terms of design review committees by the homeowners association and so on, that control the scale and the development of a community just the same way that zoning does. So Houston does have that. It also does have, as we were talking about earlier, other things in the city ordinance, minimum lot sizes and parking requirements, which do which are in every zoning code in the country virtually. And in addition, Texas has a state law that talks about zoning codes, land use regulations, and the way that cities can adopt those. And I was just I wrote an amicus brief for this case involving the city of Houston that just was handed down a few months ago, where the Texas Supreme Court said the city's historic preservation ordinance was in fact land use regulation under a narrow meaning in the statute, and thus had to abide by certain procedures in order to be adopted, which the city did, fortunately. But the Supreme Court didn't say that the historic preservation ordinance was zoning in its pure sense, but it did say that under this narrow statutory sense that the city's historic preservation ordinance was land use regulation. And so I just use that as an example to say that Houston has a lot of land use regulation, more than meets the eye. But the interesting thing about it is that, like many southern cities, a lot of what was developed is dictated by restrictive covenants. And those cannot be undone without really significant homeowner support, majority, sometimes 2/3, sometimes unanimous changes to change the deed. So those can be much more problematic actually than zoning in a place like Houston.
Another thing is in Houston, they've relaxed their minimum lot sizes. They haven't abolished them completely, but they've shrunk them significantly. So there's a lot of the development inside the 610 loop, which is the kind of center of the Houston donut, if you will, has been infill for the past 10 years or so, a little bit longer. So they've built a lot more townhouses. Density doesn't have to look like Manhattan. It can look, it can be 4 stories, it can be 3 stories, but close together. If the buildings are close together, even touching, that's just a much more economical use of the land, which means people can live closer to work. They can pay less for a house. Property taxes can be lower for anybody else who lives around there, as well as the people moving in. And then think about all the knock-on effects for schools and other public services if you have more revenue and people don't have to travel as far and spend as much of their time on the road.
So Greg kind of killed my closing question. We only have 2 minutes to close. I'll let Sara take this one to take us out. What do you say someone who's the crazy Texan who wants their acre lot and their huge truck? What's your pitch for them to buy into this idea that we need reform of our driving culture?
Well, I think that there are lots of ways that we build now that would enable that person, and I wouldn't call them crazy. That it's just, it's just a preference that's influenced by lots of different things. But there's a lot of places that we already create that would allow somebody to have a 1-acre home and drive everywhere they want to go. But what we don't have is options for everything else. In Connecticut, where we did our study, we found that 81% of residential land required about a 1 acre minimum lot size, 50% required a 2 acre minimum lot size. Meanwhile, only 2% of land in the state is zoned to allow multifamily housing as of right. So those numbers should paint, I think, a picture, if you caught them, that we allow so much of one kind of housing and so much of one kind of land development, because where we live, after all, really dictates how our communities are organized, that it really is time for us to try to allow other options. And that's how I would put it, is that we're really trying to create choices for people, not to constrain, because there's plenty of options for that person to live the way they want to live, but to enable more options for people so that we can have more equitable and sustainable and connected places as we move further into the 22nd century.
Well, thank you so much to my guests. That was a perfect close, Sara. Thank you all for listening to Getting Common. I hope you are all enlightened as I am by their scholarship and their conversations. They both have websites. They both have all of their scholarship on SSRN. So please, Google both of them and look them up if you're more interested in this stuff. If you ever miss an episode of the show, you can catch the rebroadcast anywhere that podcasts play on the Voice America Network and on our YouTube channel. Feel free to send me emails through the show page or reach out on social media. Thank you all for listening.
All right, terrific show, everyone. All clear.